Our goal today is to provide information and share the expertise of our panelists with anyone who may have questions about voting and the upcoming elections that are now less than 2 weeks away. We're getting really close. After I introduce our panelists, they will make some opening remarks and we will open the session to questions. So any attendees who would like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon that's at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question there. We would ask that you include your first name, if you will, and media members, please also include your affiliation. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So let's get right on into things with introductions. I'd like to introduce our panel, and we'll start with Dr. Kathleen Hale, a political science professor who also serves as co-director of the Election Administration Initiative and is an expert on election administration, general and changes in process, counting and certification, funding, election observers and poll watchers, and election security, which is certainly quite a hot topic right now these days. She is a faculty fellow of the McCrary Institute of Cyber and Infrastructure Security here at Auburn as well. Next is Dr. Mitchell Brown, a professor in the Department of Political Science and co-director of the Election Administration Initiative, whose expertise is election administration, general and changes in process, counting and certification, audits and recounts, mail ballots, and election security. Dr. Soren Jordan is also here with us today. He's an assistant professor in the political science department whose expertise focuses on congressional races, political parties, and election night reporting. And next up is Dr. Bridget King, an associate professor of political science who serves as director of the department's Master of Public Administration program. Her expertise includes felony disenfranchisement and rights restoration, the in-person voting experience, including demographic variations, polling locations and poll workers, including changes in response to COVID-19 and diversity in election administration. Next, we have Dr. John Fisk, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, whose expertise is management and leadership, ethics, and local government / intergovernmental relations at large. We also have Dr. Ryan Williamson, an assistant political science professor, who served in the United States Senate on the Committee on Rules and Administration as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow. His expertise is in redistricting, congressional procedure, political parties, Southern political races, and pandemic readiness. And our cleanup hitter for the day is Michael Bennett, the Executive Vice President of Outreach for Auburn Student Government Association, who will give us the students' perspective and talk about the SGA's efforts to promote participation from the student body. Michael is a senior, double majoring in political science and marketing. So at this point, we'd now like to welcome our panelists to take a few minutes to talk about what in their minds is the most interesting or important aspect of the election and the voting process as we approach November the 3rd. We're going to get things started with Dr. Kathleen Hale, who heads up the Election Administration Initiative. Dr. Hale, you have the floor.
Thank you, Preston, very much. And I want to thank Auburn University and the College of Liberal Arts for this opportunity. We're delighted to be able to speak with you all on behalf of our Election Administration Initiative and our graduate program in election administration. It's a very busy time and an exciting time for the election faculty at Auburn. We're the largest concentration of faculty in the country who specialize in all of those details about elections that are leading the news these days. We've worked with thousands of election officials around the country, and we're invested in the questions that you're hearing about. To kick this off, I'll share that my biggest takeaway from the 2020 elections is both a positive and a negative. On the positive side, there's a lot of good change going on to improve the voter experience. New methods of voting with mail ballots and early voting, vote centers, electronic poll books for check-in, curbside voting, new protections from COVID, significant improvements in election cybersecurity. And voters are engaged in these changes and they're paying attention to what these changes mean for them. And this is a good thing. We want everyone to participate and we want to count every vote as the voter intends. But there is a negative side. And on the negative side, all of this change has put pressure on the system. There are always gaps when we try to implement new ideas. And because our system is so interconnected, each of these ideas touches on other parts of the system, and it creates pressure, like lines and details about signatures and ID and other things. And too much pressure can be disastrous. One of our lessons from 2020, the whole year, and not just the November election, will have to be about how we invest in these kinds of changes to maintain resilience and transparency and accuracy and provide operations that the public can see and understand.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. Now we'll go to Dr. Brown.
Hi, thanks for having me. If I had to pick the biggest thing on my mind right now, I would say it's a concern about trust in government, about, and as a result, the political rhetoric used in the election season, particularly around trust in the local election officials and faith in the results. It is critical for the public to understand where responsibility for election rules and some of the problems associated with them lie. And often this is with state legislatures and not with election officials themselves. Election officials are extremely dedicated and hardworking people. They're interested in providing access while simultaneously ensuring integrity. More and more frequently, they find themselves implementing elections as rules are changing, sometimes day to day because of court filings and subsequent rulings. The work of the election official has become increasingly complex. And while it is often more technical and sophisticated right now, it is ultimately a human enterprise. Election officials are our neighbors. They're the people we see at the grocery store, people we go to church with. And it's really important that we remember this, not get caught up in negative narratives, and as well as not to be frightened by attempts from other countries to try and undermine our faith in the integrity of our processes and by extension, our democracy.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Brown. We'll now go to Dr. Jordan.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm super interested to see how people's demands for different types of election systems begin to vary now that we're all sort of seeing in real time what other states are doing. Traditionally, election administration has been fairly low salience. So even if other states have very different practices, like all vote by mail, there really hasn't been constituent demand to try and make your state adopt practices that you see in other states that you might like. And we've really just seen in the past states adopt practices based off of partisanship. So Republican and Democrat states tend to look fairly similar in terms of election administration. And I'm interested to see in whether or how those practices evolve, especially after 2020, and if people's experience with voting by mail, for instance, makes them want to demand different types of election administration in their own jurisdiction after this current presidential election.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jordan. We'll now go to Dr. King.
Thank you, Preston. So for me, my biggest concern right now is the unique environment that voters have to navigate and the decisions that they have to make to vote in 2020. COVID-19 has compounded challenges that many voters often have to overcome to vote. So I'm curious as to what lasting impact the nature of this particular election will have on perceptions of confidence in the system and of its outcomes.
Very good. All right, let's go to Dr. Fisk now.
Well, thank you to Auburn University and CLA, and also thank you to the participants who are with us today. When I think about the election upcoming, a couple of things that I really think about are the election administrators themselves. And many of the challenges faced by election administrators and election offices include budgetary, information technology, staffing, motivation, all of the things that many of our organizations face. And many of these factors were present prior to COVID-19, but the pandemic has placed additional stressors on many of these offices, work from home, Zoom, and that sort of thing. I am particularly curious about the lasting impact of this election, as well as COVID, and how it's going to impact election administrators and their ability to do more with less, and their ability to be resilient in the face of a lot of uncertainty and increased scrutiny.
Thank you for those thoughts, Dr. Fisk. We'll now go to Dr. Williamson.
Thanks so much. I'm thinking about what comes next. There are many electoral reforms on the ballot in 2020. State legislative races will take place, and they'll determine who gets to draw the maps in the upcoming redistricting cycle. And it'll also be important to determine if 2020 is an outlier or a sign we need to update our expectations for future elections.
Okay, great. And for the student perspective, let's go to Michael Bennett now.
Yes, thank you to the College of Liberal Arts and Dr. Hale for reaching out to SGA and including us in this event. What I'm really thinking about is the participation of young people in this election. College is a place where a lot of students find their voice as it coincides with the age of registration to vote. So I'm really interested to see how we can kind of build on this work of getting students registered to vote, but actually also get them to the polls on election day, and what impact that will have across the civic participation of their entire lives.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Those are some really great thoughts, plenty for voters to kind of keep in mind for Super Tuesday. At this point, we're now going to transition to the question and answer session. So again, we're going to try and get to as many questions as possible. We unfortunately likely won't have enough time to fill them all, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So again, to ask a question, please just make sure you click on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question in there. So to get us started, let's see, we have this question that I'll send to Dr. King. There have been reports of a lack of resources and poll workers in recent months. Has that situation improved, or is it part of what may lead to long wait times at the polls?
Sure, thanks, Preston. So based on the conversations I have had with election administrators across the country and in recent weeks, and even an article I read this morning, the situation regarding the poll worker shortage has dramatically improved. Many jurisdictions are reporting having more people volunteering to serve than they've ever had before. The willingness to serve as a poll worker is one of the many ways we have seen American citizens answer the call of democracy this election. Regarding lines, though, they can be caused by a variety of reasons. So it could be enthusiasm that exceeds expectations, a distribution of resources, which would include polling locations, voting machines, and poll workers that is unable to meet the in-person voting demand, or as we saw during early voting in Georgia, technology as they use e-poll books that were running very slowly. So all those things can contribute to lines. This year, though, we also have COVID-19 and modifications that are being made in polling locations because of the need for social distancing, which are in turn reducing the amount of equipment in polling locations and the number of poll workers, check-in stations, et cetera, but also the number of voters at a given time. And so all of those things in combination can result in lines experienced when voting in person.
Okay, and this might be a follow-up question for Dr. Fisk. How are election offices kind of coping with this, and what are some of the tools or resources they're using?
Well, so thanks for that question. And I would just echo a lot of the kind of the themes and content that Dr. King has already mentioned. And so when I think about how election administrators do their job, and in particular in this space, where what I've seen and when I've talked to them, they are working with their partners, and that can be inside the county office, their budget team, their county commissioners, their IT folks, and their own staff. As I think we've already talked about, and as well as I'm sure will come up, they are the experts. And so they're working with internal partners and they're working with external partners. That could be the Secretary of State's office, members of the media. They're also engaged in these conversations months before the lines actually start. And so the planning process has already well begun, and they're looking at course corrections should there be any need for those. And then finally, they have to rely on each other. There's a really robust network of election administrators with again a ton of expertise that can inform one another when problems and challenges do arise.
Okay, very good. This next question might be a good one for possibly Dr. Williamson. And this is one I've wondered about. Voter turnout has been considerable so far. Reportedly, a record number of Americans are voting early and by mail. Do you think that's an indication this election will have a higher turnout compared to recent votes?
Thanks, Preston. Yeah, the short answer is probably. Obviously, we won't know until after the fact, but we are definitely potentially seeing record-breaking turnout in the 2020 election. This was true in the 2018 midterm elections as well, as we saw the highest turnout in a midterm in over 100 years. And so we know that the president is a polarizing figure. We know that, as Dr. King said, enthusiasm is high. We also know that engagement and dissatisfaction are also very high. And also voters see stark differences between the two candidates. And all of these together kind of suggest that more people will want to participate in the process. However, we also know that measures to increase voting typically only make it easier for regular voters to continue to do so. They rarely expand the size of the electorate, at least not by very much. And even when they do, it's typically a one-off occurrence, and we see a reversion back to what we would normally expect in subsequent elections. So from there, the question becomes, what will in-person voting look like on election day? 2008 was the most recent high watermark, with about 58% of the voting age population showing up to vote. That election was also marked by high dissatisfaction because of the shrinking economy and the wars in the Middle East. And there was also high enthusiasm to vote for Barack Obama. And according to Michael McDonald, at least 50 million people have already voted in this election, which is over 35% of the votes that were cast in 2016. So all of that is to say, getting to 60% or perhaps even 65% turnout is well within the realm of possibility.
Okay, very good. So here's another question, and I know this is one that a lot of people are wondering about. Many experts feel we may not have a clear-cut winner on election night. So the question is, how likely do you think that is? And what will happen procedurally the rest of election week if that's the case? Dr. Jordan, is that one you might be able to take?
Sure, and I love the question. I also saw that Danielle asked it in our question and answer. So I think the answer in part depends on Dr. Williamson's response to our previous question, which is that we've seen sort of outrageous levels of turnout, which is very positive, obviously, but up to 50 million votes cast. And those are all votes that have to be counted. State by state, there's a bunch of variation in when those votes are allowed to start to be counted. Some states as early as 2 weeks before the election, so that process is already underway. Some states it's on election day, and two of the biggest states in terms of the Electoral College map, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, can't start counting those ballots until election day. So especially in those two states, it's going to take a while probably to see a declared winner. The only exception to that suggestion would be if there was an overwhelming advantage for one of the two candidates in person election day polling place voting, which we typically count. That's the traditional count that we do on election day. So if one of the two candidates saw a very, and I emphasize very strong performance on election day, you might see a declared winner. But odds are we're looking at at least a week-long, but probably a multi-week process to count all of the mail-in ballots, especially depending on how close those margins are. This is unfortunate because I like when things are resolved quickly, and I also like when I can stay up until the end of election night and know who won and go to bed and talk about it with students the next day. But it seems like that's just not going to be the position that we're in this year. And you'll see lots and lots and lots of journalistic accounting for what we should be doing in the meantime while we're waiting on a winner.
Okay, well, some great insight there. And another very timely question is up next, and this has been in the news just in the past couple of days. The FBI just reported Iran and Russia hacked into voter registration information. And so the question is, how confident are you that election results will be secure and that the election won't be tampered with? I'm thinking maybe we could possibly start with Dr. Brown, and Dr. Hale, you might have some comments after that as well.
Right. Yeah, I'll kick off the answer to this. I'll say that the two big stories that we've heard most recently about Iran and Russia and efforts to spread misinformation and delegitimize our process are focused around two things. One is the reports about direct contact to voters. And there's been some reporting that this has been because they've hacked into voter registration databases. And I will say that's not necessarily true. Those registration lists are public documents. who votes, when they vote, what party someone is affiliated with is a matter of public information. What is private is how we vote. And the systems surrounding how we vote are very secure, and the systems surrounding the vote totals are very secure. So I think we don't want to get worried that the voter registration lists are somehow public, and that's evidence of some kind of bad actor hacking into the state systems, because those are already public. And in many states, anybody can get them for free and can look on a website right now and get them. And we do this so political parties are able to contact their voters, right? The other thing going on, and Kathleen can speak more to this, is about some evidence that's come out very recently that at the county level, there are a few counties in 2 states where there is evidence that the county websites were breached, but not that the breach caused any voter information to that's private to be leaked out, or that it affected counting. So counting and certification procedures, as Soren mentioned a little bit earlier, take days, if not weeks, depending on state rules. That period is used to ensure that every qualified vote that is cast is counted. Election officials prepare for this well in advance. They prepare for possible problems. They use something called a COOP, or a continuity of operations plan, and they work closely with local, state, and national officials, both to ensure that the integrity of their systems, but also that the results are accurate. And so I don't think we need to really be afraid of that, but maybe Kathleen has some things to add to that.
Thank you, Mitchell. I agree with your assessment that we should be interested, but not necessarily worried. If we go back 4 years and look at the conversations that were happening around the 2016 presidential election, the idea of penetrating voting systems or voter registration systems was really at pretty much of a fever pitch. And I think it's worth pointing out to the audience that the federal government, through the Department of Homeland Security, in partnership with state election directors and secretaries of state, and now particularly local election offices, have made really, really significant strides in both the design and the implementation of cooperative, sophisticated information sharing systems. I think every election expert out there agrees that we are in a much different posture, and that what we might have seen, what we see in the reports, these recent reports, is really an indication that the system that is in place is working. The common conversation is that it's not if these things will happen, it's when and how many, at what time and where, and all of those questions are part of the preparedness that local election offices, the places where elections are conducted, at the local level, local election offices are extremely prepared. And I want to put this in a little bit, that preparedness idea, in just a little bit of context too. When you think about the natural disasters that have swirled around the conduct of elections, you get a sense of just how good local election officials are at doing their jobs, and how good they are at being prepared and being able to pivot. 9/11, for example, took place on a Tuesday in New York City while an election was going on. We have wildfires in the West. We had Hurricane Katrina dislocate hundreds of thousands of voters outside New Orleans in advance of a mayoral election. Hurricane Michael in the Gulf most recently just decimated election offices. And yet election officials were there with generators, and folks were able to vote. And so the big picture is that the process works. So many pieces of the process are not typically part of the public conversation. Just because we all didn't talk about them before didn't mean they weren't happening. They were happening, and they were happening very well.
Some great insight there. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Dr. Hell. So now we'll move on to a question that's sort of the student perspective focus. So we'll go to Michael Bennett on this one. And The question is, what have you been hearing from students about this year's election? And do you have any thoughts on what voter participation might look like from Auburn's student body?
Yeah, so kind of what we've seen throughout all of our efforts is that students are very, very excited to vote. For many of them, including myself, this is their first presidential election. And so that's something that's a very big deal. And kind of what we've been doing on SGA's behalf is, removing all of those barriers that may be in place to them voting. So a lot of that is just transmitting information. You can register to vote in your residence hall. That's something a lot of people don't know. You can use Tiger Transit to get to the polls, different things like that. So really our goal is to make sure that we have any student that wants to participate in the civic process is able to do so and do so as easily as possible. And so I think that student engagement is going to be very, very high in this election, just based on what I'm hearing and seeing. And I'm really, really excited to see those numbers come back, hopefully seeing a lot of Auburn students participating in the election.
Great, thanks, Michael. All right, and here's a question from Thomas. He asked, do you see some measures such as limiting the number of polling places or stricter ID requirements as active attempts to disenfranchise parts of the electorate, or are they honest attempts at election security that may have adverse side effects? I'll send this to Dr. Held to kind of divvy up amongst the group who might be best.
Sure. I'll just start by making a quick comment, which is that we need to always make sure we distinguish between policy choices that we don't like and implementation processes that may be under-resourced or difficult implementation decisions. I think Ryan, this would be a great question for Dr. Williamson.
Yeah, so thanks for that. I think Dr. Hill's point is excellent. There are policies we don't like, and then there are policies that are enacted with nefarious intentions. And a lot of times we don't know how to distinguish between those two. Election security is incredibly important, as we know, increasingly so since at least 2014, 2015. And so a number of these, if we assume good faith, then none of these things are done with positive externalities. However, there is a long history in the United States of certain electoral reforms being enacted with, completely legally, but in the pursuit of achieving some sort of partisan end. And so it is unfortunate that a lot of election administration, electoral reforms and things like that are painted along partisan lines. And I think that's just emblematic of kind of where we are now in this highly polarized environment. And so, yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on that, but happy to follow up more.
Okay, great. Well, we have another question. This one comes from Emily. She asked, how is the efficacy of presidential election results compromised by the Electoral College and its disproportionate representation of certain regions of the country? So again, we'll go to you, Dr. Held, to determine amongst the group.
Sure, and I will defer to other colleagues on this. This sounds like this is something that I think Dr. Jordan knows a lot more about than I do, and so I'm delighted to hear what he has to say.
Sure. So I'll be honest, I haven't seen specific polling numbers on how people's sort of efficacy in the process itself is shaped by the existence of the Electoral College. I've just seen lots and lots of accounts, both personal as well as journalistic, that when you have a system of indirect representation, it tends to undermine people's belief that their vote in a one man, one vote kind of system counts in the way that they believe that it actually counts. And it's for that reason that we see sort of continual attempts or conversations about changing to different types of voting systems, such as a direct election of the presidency, supplanting the Electoral College. And I'll take this moment to just sort of address as a side, another question that we saw, which is what are the likelihood that we transition to those kinds of accounts or those kinds of systems? And I would gently remind that they are constitutionally embedded. And the rules that we have that are spelled out specifically in the Constitution are typically very, very difficult to change because constitutional amendments require quite a few votes in Congress past a regular majority. So we're unlikely to see those processes amended unless there is a groundswell of support for changing Electoral College itself, or even sort of election of other offices like members of Congress to something beyond the traditional first past the post system.
Okay, we have another question here. This one is from Thomas. It says, Dr. Jordan said that Republican and Democrat election procedures are common from state to state. What do these look like and how do they differ and impact elections?
Wow, I'm going to send that to my colleague Mitchell Brown to talk about some of the key sort of top level differences around the country, and there are many.
Yeah, so it's cruel to send me a question that was meant for Soren, but I'll answer it. So we get differences at the state level and some clustering around rules that happen when state legislatures are controlled by Democrats versus state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans, as well as some clustering of different policies and procedures that happen not because of who's in control, but regionally. And so one of the things that we see is, particularly out west, a lot of real advances and innovations that happen. And some of that is fueled not by politics per se, but by necessity, right? Demands on the system. When you're in a really big geographic state, large area, but you've got few voters, you're going to have to do things a little bit differently than when you're in a small geographic area with a whole lot of voters. And so a lot of the big innovations that we see and a lot of the clustering that we see in different rules and measures, we see because of not politics, but demands on the system. But we do see some related to politics, and stricter ID requirements is a perfect example of one, right? After the Shelby v. Holder decision in 2013 and pre-clearance ends, what we start to see is heavily Republican states in particular putting in place rules around voter ID as a measure of ensuring integrity. And so that is something that this was clearly politically motivated, right? And we see some of that on the other side around opening up and expanding rules and opportunities for voting in states that are more democratically controlled. So there is some of that that we see happening around the country.
Yeah, and I apologize for stepping on the question intended for Dr. Jordan. So please, Soren, follow on.
No, I would say everything that Mitchell just said, and in fewer words than I'm currently using.
All right, well, great. Well, we are getting quite a lot of questions coming in, so we do have another. This is from Emily, a proud Auburn MPA grad, she makes sure to note. I have been seeing some historians, journalists discussing the possibility of violence and extreme voter intimidation on election day. What are your thoughts on the possibility and the severity of violence on election day?
I think we all have a lot of thoughts about that and hoping that it doesn't happen. I'm to sort of share the wealth around here. Dr. King, I'll send that to you, and maybe there are some others that want to follow on.
Yeah, so my general sense is, I don't want to say anything's possible, but so I have had conversations with election administrators who have, because they want to be able to protect the voters and ensure that they are able to participate in an environment that upholds expectations and norms of democracy, that they have invested in hiring additional security for polling locations. Does that actually mean the additional security will be necessary or needed? I do not know. I mean, I think if there's one thing we've observed throughout this election cycle is that people spend a lot of time talking about what they're going to do. But when people go to vote face to face and in person at a lot of jurisdictions, they aren't actually there in the way that they say they would be. So, I mean, my general thoughts are, I hope not. But I do know that election officials are taking their concerns very seriously and providing resources as they have access to them to ensure that everyone is able to vote in person.
Okay, great. All right, our next question comes from Lauren. And Lauren asks, what is your opinion on in-person absentee voting in Alabama?
I'll just share that I did that, and it was a 5-hour process. And while I was there, I had some thoughts. So because I saw my colleague, Dr. Williamson, there, I'll ask him to respond to this one.
Yeah, so first, it's great that Alabama has made it easier for people to vote in a safer fashion than creating long lines on election day. But as Dr. Hale pointed out, she waited about 5 hours to vote, and speaking to other people, that is not an anomalous experience. Numerous people are waiting significant amounts of time in order to be able to engage in this process. And that is because this is not necessarily unique to Alabama, but a number of states have instituted practices to expand early voting, but that has not been met with an increased capacity to address the issue. And so it's one of those things. It's a difference between what we want to do and what we have the resources to do, or what we dedicate the resources towards. And so it's great that it exists, but there are still kind of steps to be taken in order to kind of overcome some of those obstacles, like creating an hours-long process.
Yeah, I'll just follow on with that really briefly with a tiny tidbit from some research that Mitchell Brown and I did about the relative share of county resources that are allocated to election administration offices. And I'll give a shout out to Tyler St. Clair and Emily Hale, who are listening in on the call and have asked some questions here. They were graduate students who helped us with some of this. And what we found in a sample of some states was that the share of the county budget that is devoted to election offices is about 0.5%. And so, even if we were spectacularly bad at what we measured, let's say it's 1%. It's really not a lot. And so when we think about what jurisdictions are able to do, we've asked them to do a lot, and we've asked them to do a lot quickly. And we, through our elected representatives, have changed our minds, and we've gone to court, and we've come back, and we've created a really quick pace of change in an environment where we've got new constraints related to COVID. And so I think the resource piece of this going forward will be critical.
Okay, very good discussion there. Our next question comes from Tyler with Common Cause. He asks, with all of the changes in election administration this cycle, voter education is more important than ever. Through November the 3rd and in future cycles, how important is it for election administrators to build more capacity for voter education? Is it feasible? Or is this an example where collaborative partnerships with civic organizations becomes important?
This is an ideal question for John Fisk, and I'd ask Mitchell to follow on.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Tyler, for that question. When I saw that come through on the Q&A, I had a couple of thoughts originally. And the first is looking at the rules and regulations, as they're defined through through a state legislature, through a Secretary of State's office, and any kind of relevant AG opinion or court decision, and kind of limiting the behaviors that that election administrators are required to do or have to avoid. The other part is looking at the election administrators themselves and seeing how they interpret their job and what else is on their to-do list. And so you'll see a great range in terms of skills, in terms of competencies and willingness to do that kind of engagement. Some election administrators, that's a strength of theirs and they enjoy that much more than others. And so it reflects, I think, the diversity of the field itself and on whether or not that is a necessity. All that to be said, the role of third parties in terms of voter education and whether or not there's an official partnership with an election administration office, that work still goes on and is still clearly really important.
Yeah, so I'll jump in and add that we have a long history in this country of third-party groups, civic organizations playing a really important role in voter education. If you think about the League of Women Voters, which was created out of the former women's suffrage activist organization, their entire purpose when they started was to educate voters and to engage in get out the vote campaigns. And the League has been an important partner. Common Cause is now an important partner. There are increasingly more and more organizations who are jumping in to try and do some of this. However, having said that, every single election office has a public education function. It's part of the work that they do. And so I think the partnership moving forward will continue to be important, but we've got a long history of it. And so it's only who we're partnering with and the quality of that and the rules that are changing. And so this will continue to be an important part of the election landscape.
Yeah, I'll just throw in also that when we think about partnerships and voter education, there's been the 2020 has been a sort of a banner year for either existing or newly funded or newly sort of prominent groups jumping in to help. And democracy needs that. Democracy needs support, and it needs support from the public. One of the things that we're seeing this time around is some funding or some support and voter education efforts that are somewhat separate from the actual local election offices. And as well-meaning as some of those are, the connection that voters need has to lead back to the election office as the trusted source. For example, I'm looking today at materials that someone wants to distribute to a group of election officials about access to information about voting. The organization is wonderful, but voting's already begun. And so providing information now, and I think we also have to just be cognizant of the motivations that might exist behind private money, helping us with our democracy.
Okay, great discussion there. And we have another question. This one comes from Jim. And he asks, what procedures are in place to prevent voter suppression?
Dr. Brown, I'm going to ask you to start that, and there may be others who want to jump in.
Sure. I'll be happy to start, and I'm sure there will be others who want to join in. So I'll say about this question, it sort of depends on what you mean by voter suppression, right? We have a long storied history in the country of voter suppression efforts, and there have been national laws put in place to minimize that voter suppression. There is also a more recent history of people with partisan motivations who have deliberately spread misinformation and disinformation, and even locally, right, about when election day is or what you need to take to the polls, and that's a form of voter suppression. And so how you counter that kind of voter suppression is by good public education, right? The other conversation happening about voter suppression, though, right now is a conversation that we've alluded to already, which is about are there certain rules that state legislatures are putting into place that are having a disproportionate impact that's negative on voter turnout for certain groups. I'd say felon disenfranchisement rules are a perfect example of that. And maybe on that note, I'll hand it over to Dr. King to see if she wants to add anything there.
Sure. Oh, there we go. Sure. I forgot to unmute myself. Sure, I'd be happy to. So I guess two things. So on the matter of suppression, to Mitchell's point, I think it is important to clearly define what we're talking about. Because as we talked about a little bit earlier, there can be administrative decisions that are made to achieve an administrative end that can have a potential suppressive effect. For example, because of budget constraints or other constraints, you might relocate a polling location or reallocate some resources to achieve another goal, which in turn might result in lines or other conditions that have the potential to be negative for voter turnout, particularly for marginalized populations. On the matter of felony disenfranchisement, there's also the potential for suppression there. The actual legal suppression that or disenfranchisement that limits the right to vote for citizens with felony convictions across many of the states across the United States. But also there is misinformation about what the rules are related to felony disenfranchisement. So there's a range. So in some states, particularly Maine and Vermont, people with felony convictions can vote even when they're incarcerated. And then the consequences get more punitive, leading up to states where people are disenfranchised while they're incarcerated, and then also once they're no longer under supervision. And so I think, if we're talking about voter suppression and what that looks like, it's important to be very specific about what sort of acts, whether they be administrative or policy decisions, that might result in a disproportionate negative impact on a specific population that in turn might result in them not participating.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Brown, Dr. King. Okay, we have another question from Zachary. Zachary asks, he says, there's been a lot of ink spilled over the threat of widespread voter fraud. What do the numbers actually show? Is the number of cases anywhere near enough to actually impact statewide races?
Oh, I imagine every person on the panel has something to say about this question. I'll ask Ryan to start, and please, a couple other folks jump in on this.
Yeah, great. So thanks so much, Dr. Hale. To the question of what do the numbers say, when last I checked, we're up to about 45 cases of voter fraud in the last 20 years of over more than 1.5 billion votes cast. And so I think that's like 0.801% of cases that are actually fraudulent. And it's not systematic. Typically, these are one-off instances and often done by mistake. And so the idea that fraud is a rampant problem is simply not borne out by any sort of empirical investigation. And the idea, I think one of the reasons why we're hearing so much about this recently is the increased use of mail-in balloting. But there are 5 states, so 10% of the country, that have been using mail-in balloting for years. Not just in response to the pandemic, and they do not see increased instances of fraud there. And so mail-in balloting is safe and fraud is essentially non-existent.
Okay. All right. Thank you. It's looking like we're going to have time for about another question or two. So we're going to go to Matney, who asks, I am interested in hearing the panelists' opinion on the top 5 voting plan proposed by Michael Porter and Catherine Gill in their recent book, The Politics Industry. And this comes from Matney, who is a graduate student in Auburn's MBA program.
Yeah, that is a great question. To summarize, and I hope I'm summarizing the thrust of the book correctly, or at least the top 5 idea. It has to do with congressional races, U.S. congressional races. I think it may extend inside states. I'm not quite sure, but into state legislative races. But it involves essentially what we might call in the business a nonpartisan jungle primary, where everyone who wants to run runs, and then in their proposal, the top 5, regardless of party, because party identification is seen as a hindrance, not a benefit. Then that group of folks would be on the ballot in a ranked choice voting process. We call RCV, and I can say that both of those ideas are out there in the election system now, in different ways. California uses a jungle primary, which results oftentimes in having 2 members of the same party running off. And a number of municipal elections are focusing in different parts of the country. Minnesota, in particular, and a couple of other places have looked at and use ranked choice voting to determine the winner. And I'll just say from my own observations, thinking about, there's deep systemic change on one side and ideological sort of how should our system work kinds of questions, and then on the other side there's the practical administrative process that election administrators are charged with operating. I haven't encountered many election administrators who would embrace the idea of ranked choice voting, but that may not have anything to do with whether they like the idea or not. It's a change, and it's an operational change that is significant. Anyone who's implemented it would tell you that. And the same with the jungle primary. There may also be some demographic effects of that, but I'm not a turnout scholar, and so that's a little bit beyond what I'm comfortable with. Soren, Mitchell, John, Bridget, that's what I know about this book, and I've only read some parts of it. I'm looking forward to reading the whole thing.
Sure. So it illustrates one of my favorite things about the American election system, and that it's embedded in federalism. So we get to see tons of state and municipal level experimentation in voting systems. And it gives us all this evidence about how different theories in the abstract might play out in reality. And ranked choice voting in particular is something that sounds really very interesting in the abstract, but has some problematic implementation problems, as well as just problems in terms of how it's addressed among the actual voters. So for instance, there's research suggesting that when California made the switch to jungle primaries in the mid-2000s, most voters weren't even aware that it had happened. Because incumbent Democrats kept on winning anyway. And it was more confusing to voters than it was helpful in terms of spurring competition. In political science language, we might say that it didn't encourage any more proximity voting. So the candidates didn't get any closer to the actual voters. They stayed fairly far apart because people kept on looking for the same sorts of shortcuts in signals that they use now, which is somebody who matches their party identification and somebody whose last name they tend to recognize out of a tenure and long service, which I think suggests the second part that might be a problem in implementation, which is ranked choice voting requires a lot of information on behalf of voters, information that not all voters tend to have. And if you start putting these informational burdens on people to feel like they can really cast a ballot. So for instance, imagine choosing between 2 candidates with very clearly delineated shortcuts like party identifications, and moving to a system where you have to choose among 5 candidates who don't have those shortcuts. Only certain kinds of people are going to recognize the 5 names on the ballot and understand how even the ranking system works, let alone their own preference of them. And those informational constraints might have a very limiting influence on the kinds of people who would actually participate in such a system that we have to be very, very cognizant of as we think about it as a broader conversation.
Yeah, I'll jump in with one more quick thing, and I'll be quick because And that is that every few years, some really smart people come up with a great idea about how they're going to fix American politics and how broken it is. And the thing to remember, and they've all been interesting ideas, and I've loved reading every one of these books, but the thing to remember is what Soren said earlier, right? We have rules, and constitutional amendments are really unlikely to happen. And so I think the better way to spend our time is to think about how to fix the system within the current rule structure that we have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The cake is really, really well baked.
All right. Well, we now have time enough for one final question, and this one comes from Jordan. Jordan asks, many of my peers and I have been quite concerned about high racial tensions on Election Day in regards to in-person voting. Will this negatively affect racial minorities voting in this election?
That's a really important question, and I think that one of the things to keep in mind, and there are many more than what I'll just mention briefly. One of the things to keep in mind is that thinking back about that preparedness that I mentioned, every local election in-person polling site has long established, well established rules about proximity of outsiders to the polling location, observers and poll watchers and monitors. Every state has rules. Every state has processes where folks have to identify themselves within a certain boundary and can't interfere with voters and can't intimidate. And so even under that blanket statement, recently, and I can't name the jurisdictions offhand, but I read recently that there are states that have pushed back what we would call the electioneering line from, say, 40 feet to 100 feet or 100 feet to 200 feet to push interested observers who may or may not have agendas of their own, to push those folks back away from the poll site so that all voters have the opportunity to go to the polling location unencumbered, unimpeded. This might have been in Virginia. Someone else on the panel may know better than I do, where essentially either law enforcement or other representatives of the election office had to actually escort voters through a line. In my experience dealing with election officials, that has to happen only one time, and they stop it.
All right. Well, thank you all for that great insight, everyone. Unfortunately, that's our final question, so we're now out of time. But we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we really appreciate our esteemed panelists taking the time to be with us for this important discussion. We're blessed to have a treasure trove of experts among our faculty here at Auburn. And we provided their unique insight via our popular Expert Answers Q&A series that can be found online at auburn.edu/experts. And we encourage everyone to check it out. We'll provide a link to the full recording of this session and our story coverage, which will be accessible via the Auburn newsroom at ocm.auburn.edu/newsroom, and on the College of Liberal Arts website, cla.auburn.edu, for anyone who missed today's webinar. If there are any members of the media who have additional questions for our experts or need anything else, please contact me at the email provided on the media advisory you received. Thank you all again, and we hope everyone has a great weekend.